relaxing and peaceful weekend where you recharged your batteries and discovered some sort of inner peace about yourself? Or did you spend the whole weekend editing videos and doing whatever else you've got to do? Nice. Okay, so let's start. Oh yeah. That one. This is the bit where this video gets leaked and I get excommunicated from the whole potential position. Is it working? Cool. All right, so this is a little bit of a special, different, however you want to put it, lecture, in that this is a talk about my work, and the reason why I'm doing this is it's not very similar to the work that other people do. Makes any sense. So this is a kind of way of broadening your scope on what you think computational design could be. So a very large proportion of what you'll see will be making shapes, optimizing workflows, making things more efficient. And it's all kind of in service of making what we do already a bit faster or a bit more profitable, or maybe pushing the boundaries of what kind of shapes we're doing. The work that I'm trying to do at work is to kind of change the way that we think about design of buildings particularly, kind of quite radically. And so this started as a talk that I gave at the University of Calgary 2 years ago. And we've been working on it and working on it and working on it. And it's quite weird and quite radical. But what I would like to get from you is a sense of whether what your thoughts are about this at the end. So don't just like sit there as if it's like a Netflix special and like clap at the end and then leave. Like ask questions as we go along if you feel like it. So this title I kind of just made up one day and it stuck. But the second part is really important. So if you're buying, you want to build a tower, does anyone have any vague idea of how much a tower costs? Like a tower in the city? Like roughly, magnitude. Is it $1 million? Point up for more. Good. Anyone who didn't put their hands up there really needs to like read the newspaper a bit more. So is it more than $10 million? Put your hand up a bit more, so. Okay. Is it more than $50 million? Yeah, you're in the $100 million mark, right? Roughly. So if you're spending $100 million, how do you know that what you're buying is going to do what it says it's going to do? If you're buying a car, you're going to have a load of numbers attached to it that say whether it does what it says on the tin or not. So if you get into a new Veyron and you floor it and it takes 30 seconds to get up to speed, you're going to feel like you've been gypped. But if you do that in a building, no one really knows. So I've been trying to work out this new kind of way of thinking about the world. So we currently, in my view here, have a pointy stick view of the world, and I'm thinking about things from a carrier bag point of view. And so the structure of this is basically that there's going to be an organizing principle, which we've just seen, some slightly dodgy history, a new idea, and like then what we're going to do with it, basically. And so this is an Isaiah Berlin quote, which is basically me caveating the fact that this isn't particularly enthusiastic scholarship of history, but it's going to like make a point. So this is a team that we were until quite recently. Of that, Anissa, Sophie, and East graduated from this course. So this is the kind of thing you could be doing in a couple of years' time. Graduate. So these are not like widely held views. These are quite heretical ideas in architecture. So don't like go around quoting me as if it's a good idea. Like think about it a bit before you say it. So I'm not trying to like cut down the rest of the profession. I'm trying to find a way that we can kind of go forwards, do things a bit better in future. And it's mostly for kind of self-taught. So where are we going? This is the organizing principle. So there's an essay by Ursula Le Guin, which if you want to read it, I can send it to you. It's really good. And it's about the idea that history is about stories. And the stories that we write tend to be about heroic characters. And the stories that we write tend to leave out other important but less heroic things. And so this is her. She died in 2018. Very good author, probably one of my favorites. And this is the kind of story that we tend to write. We talk about people heroically defeating the mammoth, how someone was killed in the process, how everyone worked together and it was a great endeavor. And we tend not to talk about important technologies like the basket or the carrier bag or the fishnet. But those are, if not as important, maybe more important. They allow you to do things. So if you're gathering berries, until you have a bucket or a bag or something like that, the most you can carry is a handful because you need your other hand to pick the berry. Right? And there's not very many berries in a handful. So it really changes the way that a society is structured. And so if we think about it from like carrier bag perspective versus pointy stick perspective, any given technology can be given some amount of one or the other. So machine guns are kind of pointy stick and carrier bags are kind of carrier bag. And so this is a Mousgoum hut from Cameroon. They're written about pretty extensively by Christopher Alexander in Notes on the Synthesis of Form. And they have this shape, various reasons. They shed the water, you can climb them on the little steppy things, but they're also the way that parents built their hut. And so you get your hut, you build it the same way they did. And over time they will change, but only very slowly. There's no concept of big D design in here. They're what Alexander calls an unself-conscious design, where they evolve over time, kind of at roughly the same speed as evolution happens. This one's an entirely carrier bag, pointy stick kind of technology. This is, I think it's Deal Castle. Yeah, Deal Castle, which is actually quite near where I grew up. And it's got these roundy things. It's got sort of roundy towers. It's got a massive moat. It's built right on the sea. And it allows you to be incredibly well defended for the technology at the time. So this is a very heavily militarized technology. So we think about what the point of architecture is. We're in a room that stops us from getting wet or cold. We want to show that we're kind of fancy people. We've got a like nice building. We want to make some profit if we're property developers or something along those lines. And potentially want to be defended from things other than the weather, like bears or people with sticks or cannons. And if you kind of think about this from a pointy stick point of view, we start with Motte and Bailey castles, like this one, and got the Motte at the bottom and the Bailey at the top. They're just a way of living in a defended village, right? So if you get overrun at the bottom, everyone runs up to the top and they throw rocks down. And then as technology evolves, you start to see siege engines. This is the Mongols from 12 something, and they've got bows, they've got parapets, they've got what looks like a very basic trebuchet, although this guy's sitting in it, which is kind of weird. Anyway, they're laying siege to a building which appears to be made of bricks, all that sort of stuff. And so what we see at this period of time, from, I don't know, 4000 BC, maybe a bit before that, up to maybe the 17th century, you see these buildings and they're very strongly a military technology. So the same kind of investment in military technology that we see today is going into building design. And so as we keep going, you start seeing more siege technology appearing and more building technology appearing to counter it. So you've got thicker walls to deal with battering rams. See that one is pointing up? that's because they would have built very thick at the bottom, but it uses a lot of stone, so you get thinner as you go up. So if they can bash that wall like 5 meters up, they can dig a hole in it. And then you end up with stuff like this. So that's a trebuchet firing like a cubic meter boulder that's higher at something. They can lob all kinds of things. So you want to be able to throw stuff over the walls or throw. They love throwing like defeated soldiers back over the wall because that sent a whole bunch of disease in. But it was also super freaky when you saw like James fall out of the sky next to you. And then things start to get a bit dicey for the building. So with the kind of widespread use of gunpowder and cannons, suddenly no amount of wall can really stand up to you. See, we've got these round columns, round towers. Round towers don't have corners that you can bash off with a cannon. So they're starting to use cannons. These are relatively small cannons. They're also using much more advanced siege engines, like they push a tower up to the thing and you just jump over the wall. And so as the technology starts to run out, the value of buildings as military things is kind of decreasing and decreasing and decreasing. And then we get to the Enlightenment. And at the point of the Enlightenment, we discovered a bunch of new things. So this really screwed buildings. So these guys doing their kind of geometrical stuff suddenly worked out that you could calculate cannon fire. And more importantly, if you knew what the trajectory of your cannon was going to be, if you had maps that were metric maps, they showed you distances rather than topological relationships. So this is a topological relationship map. So it's great because you can go from here to here and you turn right here and you turn left at the tree and then you go past the pub and it gets you where you want to go. That's really useful. But have you ever seen the phrase ordnance survey written on a map? That's because they were surveying things to put ordnance into the field. They wanted to know where they could park their cannon so that they could shoot the thing at the right distance. They needed to be able to like draw arcs on the maps to work out where they needed to defend. So once you can start doing trigonometry and all of this kind of stuff, which they've had for a long time, but wasn't kind of widely available, buildings started to become less valuable as military assets, but became more valuable for showing off. And so if you think about what a Middle Ages castle looks like versus a like Louis XIV chateau. Louis XIV chateaus had like windows on ground level. There's no way they're defending against cannons, but they look amazing. Like they're covered in gold, they're very fancy. And from that drawing, from all that military stuff, we start to get instruments like this. And so this was very much a discussion at the beginning of the Grasshopper world, when people were like, we can start building tools, we can start building instruments that allow us to do interesting things with our building designs. But this is no new thing. So this is a sort of angle measuring device. It's got all sorts of angles, information engraved on it. And these tool makers became rock stars. This is an architectonic sector for doing proportions, all that sort of stuff. And so every time someone came up with a new tool, it allowed people to do new kinds of drawings and design new kinds of buildings, which is dead fancy. And remember last week, we were showing the Voronoi diagram that Jon Snow used to work out where that pump was. These were doing the same thing, but a bit earlier. They're allowing people to draw particular types of proportional progressions and that kind of thing. And so there's this nice quote from Alfred North Whitehead, who was Bertrand Russell's collaborator for a long time, which is civilization advances by extending the number of important operations which we can perform without thinking about them. So if you think about getting milk out of the fridge, that is pretty easy, but having to go into a field and milk a cow so that you can get this milk is kind of hard work, right? So as we abstract away more and more of these things, we're able to build on that. So the whole standing on the shoulders of giants thing takes you into the ability to do new things. So eventually we end up at this stage where it's peak pointy stick. We can do pretty much everything with buildings that we need. And then someone comes up with a new technology of big ass cannons. So not only do they get bigger, but they also get more mobile and more powerful. So the kind of previous cannons that were like foot and they'd throw a rock, these things are like shooting iron balls very fast in kind of almost straight lines because they're going so powerfully, and they'll just take down walls. And so Manuel de Landa talks a little bit about this in his book, that 1,000 Years of Nonlinear History. There's this idea that at some point architecture stops being a military technology. And I don't think we've really recovered from that. And so we're still thinking very much about what they're for. So if we don't have a military purpose as building designers, we've got showing off, profit, and keeping a well-tempered environment, like keeping the rain out, keeping us warm. And so we've got air conditioning and we've got heating, which extends the range of places where we can live from basically the like lighter green bit, which is kind of where you could live without air conditioning. And you can kind of live in the red bit if you want, but it's pretty hot. And so now we have air conditioning and we have heating. We can live basically on the whole thing. There's people living everywhere on that map. And so we've kind of solved the well-tempered environment. There are still questions about how do we do it efficiently, but we can live anywhere we want. Like the whole Middle East should not be occupied by people. It's incredibly harsh environment, but through technology we've managed to tame that. And then we've also kind of got to the point where if you can think of a shape and you've got enough money, you can build it, right? So we can build completely absurd things like this that don't seem to have any kind of structural logic to them or really any purpose, but we can do it, right? Any amount of money and fiberglass together will get you anything you want. So that kind of leaves us with profit. And it's a bit of an uncomfortable one to have to think about our purpose being profit driven. But it's largely outside of what we can control. Partially because the way that the property development industry works kind of happens before it gets to architects, but partially also because we're not offering any alternatives to that. They are trying to push the envelope of what they know because they're not being offered any new alternatives. So if we go back to this kind of long tail, we're running down this value time graph to sort of nothing, right? So architecture's in this crisis period now where the question of what's the point is coming up more and more. And people say things like, oh, it's the value of design, but we've never really been able to say what the value of design is in any kind of coherent way. And so this crisis period is really interesting. And so if we need to go on another perspective, we have to go on another version. So this is your like very traditional way of delivering a building. You get a client, they talk to an architect, the architect draws a picture, and then the builder builds the house, whatever the building is. Right? That's kind of how everyone thinks about this in most situations. However, in most buildings, they're very big, right? So most buildings that an architect will be involved in, it's not just a house that has some people in it. It would be a university like this, where there's bajillions of stakeholders, and they talk to a client representative who then talks to the architect, who then draws a picture, who then talks to a builder, who then tells other people, subcontractors, to build. Which is also really kind of a simplification of how it works. Because at every point here, there's return cycles. So the subcontractor will tell the architect that something's not working, and then they have to work it out. The client's representative has these discussions with the stakeholders. The architect is going to have discussions with the builder and with the client. And these networks of communication are incredibly complicated. And this sort of mentality puts the architect right in the middle of the process, which is not really true. This is Howard Roark from the film The Fountainhead by Ayn Rand. Has anyone heard of Ayn Rand? Um, he's sort of this super top dog genius kind of character in a very Ayn Randian way. And the only way that you can really operate in this model where you think you're the center of the universe is by being a kind of sociopathic lunatic, where you think you're right all the time and nobody else has any kind of real sway in it. So this is the kind of archetypal sociopath architect. He is super top dog. And I think she, when she was writing the book, intended to praise him as a sort of brilliant person, but actually he kind of diagnoses the problem with architecture quite nicely in that by focusing this much power in one person, we end up with a problem. So this idea of buildings ever being finished, we think of this as a finished building. But I'm sure you could think of things that you could do to this building to make it a bit better, right? Like maybe move this a bit to the left or something like that. And so this idea of buildings being finished is a really sort of dangerous one because it leads you to think that you are delude yourself into thinking that things are done. And this is kind of shown quite nicely by the Sulman Award, which is the top architectural award for buildings in New South Wales. And you can win this award for a building that hasn't ever been occupied. Win it before the people move in. And so the idea that you can win a prize for a really good building that has never had any people in it sort of tells you where the profession puts its value, and it's not on occupant happiness. So you have good photos, it fits with this self-image as a profession, you get repeat business, you get awards, those sorts of things. Those are the things that people care about, but they don't care about whether the building works. So going back to the car analogy, if you designed a really nice looking car, it's just a shocker to drive, and it won a lot of awards, people would think you were crazy for giving that car awards. But actually, that's how architecture works. So we go back to Howard. And at this point in time, this was like the 50s, being creative was not really seen as a good thing. These buildings are not really particularly creative in any sense. They're kind of classical modernism stuff. And he's more of like an executor. He's like businessy, he's sort of savvy, all that sort of stuff. And what's happened is that how did architects go from being the absolute top dogs of the creative fields straight after the war to being what I think is kind of last place at the moment? And my guess is that, and this is not based on any data, that we ended up with some nerds. So the nerds have a way of doing things, which is they assume that whatever they're doing could be done better. And so they had a kind of blind spot humility. And so if you write something down, you have a process of investigating what's going on. So this is a very shonky way of doing early UX experiments, of trying to work out where people were putting their fingers. Because you can't tell that from the inside of the screen. You just know that a finger was there. You don't know if it was like this or like that. This process of investigating the users led them to understand things a bit better. And so if you think about the architects, and the architects are here, and then the other creative fields are here, it wasn't so much that the architects got worse. It's more that everyone else just got much better because they had this process of introspection. It's a kind of classic hare and tortoise situation, that the hare just sat around, the tortoise slowly took over. So this combination of process introspection, talking to your users, and instrumentation, so understanding whether what you did was a good thing or not, led to a kind of scientific method explosion in design, which architecture hasn't kind of picked up. And so if you think about the internet is very unfinished. Things are changing all the time. Your websites that you regularly go to get redesigns, and they're just constantly trying to capture people's attention or get more clicks, or they'll tweak the color of a button. They're really small things just to make the things work a little bit better. And so that unfinished nature of the web is leading it to this very quick process, like very quick turnaround of getting better and better. And so if we go back to this, our kind of pointy stick value has kind of run out, but our carrier bag value hasn't really started to be exploited. So we end up with this big gap in the middle, this vacuum. And nature doesn't like vacuum. So things feel uncertain, they feel wrong at the moment in the profession. So what would it mean to go all in on carrier bags? Like what does it mean to be a kind of carrier bag philosophy? And I think that the carrier bag philosophy is about thinking about the people in the building, thinking about what their needs are. And by doing that, I reckon you can end up with some pretty spectacularly profitable outcomes. But it really attacks the identity politics and the identity kind of value system of the people who are currently in the architecture and generally the building industry. So hold all of those thoughts in your head, and I'll show you a couple of experiments, and then we'll try and roll them all back into each other. So this was the shakedown was a paper and a project that we did a couple of years ago. Does anyone know what the rules for picking a urinal are? Just in general, like you're going into a bathroom and there's three urinals and someone's in the left one and the right one. What do you do? Yes. So, but people have talked about this a lot, right? People have written a lot about this a lot, but no one's ever done the experiments. And we found one experiment that was done in the 70s by two undergrads who hid in a cubicle and like put their eye to the slit in the door and wrote notes. That was the only work that's ever been done on this before. So we're like, okay, let's work this out. So we built this little thing. And it sits there on a piece of polystyrene glued to the ceiling, and it's just taking measurements. So we're looking at this, very exciting. I don't know why we didn't like the piss map, but and we've got zones here, the left one, the middle one, the right one. You can see each pixel there is one sensor. So we have 64 temperature sensors, and it's looking at this thing. And the important thing here is that it's not a camera. This is where we get into some real interesting philosophical stuff, like what becomes a camera. As far as the law is concerned, we think it's not a camera. If it was a camera, we'd all go to jail. So we're arguing that it's not a camera. And so what you see pretty clearly is that we've got lots of people going to the left one, which is this one, the closest. Most as many going to the right, and hardly anyone going to the middle. And I think most of those middle visits are me just trying to mess with things. I probably shouldn't have done that, but we do see very close distribution amounts. And this mammals number here, someone got an Ig Nobel award for showing that all mammals take 21 seconds plus or minus 12 seconds to urinate. Because as you get a bigger animal, you get a bigger pipe. So an elephant taking a piss will take the same roughly amount of time as a mouse taking a piss, because they just have bigger pipes. So we're able to build this state transition diagram. So given that you're in this state or all empty, then 14% of the time someone will go to the middle, 47% of the time someone will go to the left, and 39% of the time someone will go to the right. And so what we can do with this is it's basically like you can float around this by rolling a dice to work out what the state is. If you do that a lot of times, we end up with a simulation model. And simulation models allow us to model how the world is going to work. This is a very powerful model. We want to know if it extends to bigger sets at some point, but this is kind of gold dust to the toilet design world. And so we did a similar thing. We proposed a similar thing for a combination of hand washing and cubicles. And Baptiste did some very good work working out where to put sensor. So we had this big optimization process that worked out where the sensor was supposed to go. And we assumed it was going to be in the back, but actually it's much more effective in the other side. So we built this system which can tell the difference between standing and sitting. because what we discovered that instead of waiting, people would actually go into a cubicle. And then we realized that actually cubicles had been massively unstudied. No one really knows what happens in cubicles. We've got a list of 50 something things that people have said that people do in cubicles, but there's no evidence for that because it would be illegal to collect most of it. So what we were able to do was build this, which is a much fancier version of the previous one. And it's basically just the same piece of tech, just in a different box. And one of the problems with this is that reality is very complicated. And so things get hot and then they melt themselves. So what Batiste was able to do with that, which was kind of amazing, was build a system that was able to differentiate 12 different behaviors in a cubicle. So you could tell the difference between like taking a piss or reading a book and that kind of thing. And so the current laws are based on people just making stuff up. Like there was a paper in 2019 when we were doing this that the big innovation was that they had 2 stopwatches rather than just one. So they're able to time more people going in and out. So the timing, they would sit outside and they would count door to door. So we don't know how long people spend in the cubicle. We don't know how long they spend doing what in the cubicle. We don't know how much they wash their hands, any of those things. All of this stuff is kind of a mystery. And so the idea here is by understanding what people do in buildings, we can design buildings much better, particularly for people who haven't traditionally been represented in the design. So most cubicles are designed for men because most cubicle designers are men, have been traditionally. And so traditionally, women have been really underrepresented in cubicle use. So if you've got like a big skirt, a baby, and loads of shopping stuff, you've got nowhere to put it. And as like clothing becomes more homogenous between sexes, it becomes less important, but it's also still a kind of big deal to work out how we can design spaces that are actually kind of properly inclusive rather than just tolerable for most people. So the idea of being tolerable for most people goes across a whole bunch of other domains as well, rather than just whether you can get into a toilet cubicle in time. Is it bright enough for you? Is it loud enough or quiet enough? These sorts of things. So we've got this little guy that measures temperature, light, sound, has a bunch of other things. And they're really fun to play with. I think you might be playing with one of these in a couple of terms' time. And we ended up having them on the top of everyone's monitor. And they would measure sound. So you can tell the kind of sound changing over the space. You can watch the environmental data changing so that light stuff is kind of changing. Solidly, the temperature doesn't move very much, but does. And all of this information is just useful to people to be able to choose where to go. You want to sit somewhere warmer. You kind of see this a lot, that depending on where you're sitting, some people will be in t-shirts, other people will have like full blankets over their shoulders. People run at different temperatures, making them all sit together seems a bit cruel. So this is just sort of sound at their desk, and no surprises, it gets quieter at night, all that sort of thing. This is interesting to know. This was another one that did meeting room counting. That's me lying down, taking a play, getting a meeting room counter that was using image recognition to count people. So what we can see here is the number of people in the room over the time. So you can see this day, no people went. Day, there was a big spike with 7 people. This is, bear in mind, this is a 2-person meeting, right? So how we design offices is based on the fact that, oh, we have this many 2-person meetings. Well, why are there 7 people in the 2-person meeting? Turns out it's because there were 2 people who were more senior in the next meeting room, and this group was a junior, like early careers group. And they didn't feel like they could pull rank and kick the 2 people out of the big meeting room, even though they would have been much better off turned around. So it has interesting social implications. But CO2 as well, super interesting thing to measure. I've got one of these in my bedroom now, and if I leave the window closed for more than a couple of hours, it starts to go off because the CO2 level gets too high. So if you run that for something like this, which is a table tennis contest, sucked in like temperature and CO2. And this is the sound level. So let's have a look through this data set. The red line is CO2, and the blue line is blue line is temperature. Blue line is CO2, red line is temperature. And so as we're going through this, you can read off the CO2 numbers on the side, temperature numbers centigrade on the right. And that's the time period, Friday to Friday. That's Friday like afternoon to Friday midnight. So it's only 6 hours. So this is Aidan giving a little speech. And this is the table tennis contest. And anytime that people were above this, people were saying, oh, this is a bit difficult because people were drinking pretty hard as well at the time. So it's difficult to tell whether it's the CO2 or the booze that was causing problems. But what we do see is this people care about this a lot in education now, about whether they want to make sure that people have good CO2 levels. Like if we had a CO2 monitor in here, we could see, usually if you're in a lecture theatre and you start getting sleepy, if you looked at the CO2, it would be like 1500. Kind of amazing how fast it goes. And so you see that it starts to level off as a lot of people leave the space. And just this little peak here of CO2 levels out. That's the final. People are really working hard and shouting a lot in that period. Then as people leave, the CO2 really starts to go down again. But we've got this interesting section here where a bunch of people came back after going out for some drinks, played a bunch more. And at this point, the CO2 rises, but also the temperature rises because at 9 p.m. there, the air conditioning for the building switches off. So all of this stuff, by having the instrumentation, you can start to tell stories about the evening in a way that you really kind of wouldn't expect to be able to, based on the temperature and the temperature and CO2 sensor. You wouldn't expect to be able to say, oh, there's a thing going on. So if we look at this across a much longer time scale, so this is the whole weekend. We've got table tennis stuff here, and we've got this big spike here, and we couldn't work out what it was. We didn't know, like nothing was planned. And it turned out that the big UX meetup in space that weekend. So we're able to investigate the space and find out what's going on based on quite simple sensor data. So with a couple more layers of what was going on, we could tell quite rich stories, which is super interesting because over time, rather than telling quite rich stories about what specifically happened this weekend, we can start saying things about what happens at the weekend in general, what happens during the week. And then because of that, we can start to say how this affects people, because none of this stuff is actually interesting unless you think about how it affects people. So this is the office, this is relationships between people. What I wanted to figure out was how does information flow through the building? How does it flow through the people? So a person here knows a lot about A, but not very much about B. A person here doesn't know anything about A, knows quite a lot about B. Can we get them to share information until it levels out? So this is a social network of all the emails that people send to the company. Quite old now, so send a lot fewer emails, a lot more teams messages. This idea that these two people have quite a powerful relationship. This person doesn't really talk to anyone. These weirdos out on the edge. And this person's 2 hops away from their it turns out this person right in the middle here is actually just the finance person. He emails everyone their timesheet every week. So that builds a really strong connection. But builds a very broad connection, but not a very strong one. If it's thickness of these areas. Whereas these people have a much stronger connection, but not to many people. So knowing about those social networks and knowing about the environment of the space, can you start to mess around with the space to make it suit? So this is what I was saying about this right here. These green lights are saying, I'm free, come and bother me. And the red lights are saying, I'm working, don't you dare talk to me. And when the red light counts down, you can talk to me. And so you're kind of like ticking it down. And you've got this little dashboard that shows you what's happening, what the temperature was like, how long have you got left on your timer, all that kind of stuff. And you can also match your what you've been doing in your calendar to what you've been doing in terms of work time. And what we saw was that over the day, about 8 o'clock here, we start to see that we get a dip around lunchtime, and these areas of people really wanting to focus. We discovered that people really want more environmental variety, places that they can go and focus rather than just having a kind of quiet area. There's still quite a lot of available of saying I'm doing work, but you can come and talk to me, because kind of talking to people is kind of the point of the office, right? We haven't redone this stuff since COVID, but it would be really interesting to see whether people were still using the office as a place to work rather than using as an office as a place to communicate. So the idea then is that we've got all this information. We know about what people are doing. We know about what the environment's like. We know what people should be doing. We know what people, who people know and how they're getting their work done. And so we want to make buildings more efficient, right? And we want to change the building to fit the people, because does everyone know the Peter Pan story? Surprisingly quiet. Does anyone know the Peter Pan story? Okay, good. So one of the things that Peter Pan does is that he adjusts the Lost Boys to fit into the tree that they live in, which is kind of weird. We think about changing things to fit us, to fit around us, but actually it happens surprisingly often in our world that you think about losing some weight so your jeans fit again. You think about throwing out your stuff so you can fit them in your house, that kind of stuff. And we do this all the time in offices, where we change the way we work to fit the office, which doesn't seem like a very good way to do things. We really want to be changing the office to fit the way that we work. And so if you've got an office that's not really working out for you, like you've got a giant moose standing on your desk or something like that, you probably want to change it a little bit. And so we did a little project to work out whether you could take, this is a 6 by 2 meter floor slab. We worked out that you can just pull it out with a little forklift and stick it in a lift, and then you can replace it with a staircase. Easy peasy. And why would you want to do that? This is kind of the interesting question, is that if you can change your office environment on a daily basis, potentially, then why wouldn't you? So what's interesting is that you often sit in the same spot in this room. You could sit anywhere you want. Is this the spot that is perfect for you? If you could come in earlier and choose the spot that you want to sit in, would you still sit in this spot? And so if you've got space available, kind of whatever you want, whenever you want it, it changes the way that you can buy space. Instead of renting an entire office for a 5-year period, which is currently the way things are done, you could rent it for a day, or you could rent it for an hour, which is sort of the way that WeWork type places work. But then how do you do something in between? You want something for a week, you want something for 2 days. And you want to think about things from a more sophisticated billing model, where you do want a space, but you don't really care what space it is. You want to sit somewhere, but you don't really mind, or you desperately want to sit next to this other person, but you don't mind where those 2 seats are, or you specifically want this seat at this time. And we have a vocabulary for that coming from cloud computing, that if you want to reserve an instance of some sort, you have to pay more for it because you're buying
that particular time. But if you just have a job that needs to get done, you can put it in a queue and it gets done wherever it gets done. And so you scaling between convenience and cost, and that works really well. So the kind of big picture view here, I think, to sum up, is that we're going to see much more in the way of kind of anthropology done in design. We see it a lot already in other design fields, particularly doing stuff on the internet. So rather than saying web design, it's like web-based product design has loads of people doing discovery about what people want, how people work. We're also going to see that in architecture, I think, soon, but we don't know how to do that. We don't have any of the training. We don't have any of the means to absorb that information, even if we did have the information about people. So when you tell an architect, oh, look, this is what the reports say about how people behave, they tend to just ignore it because they're not very good at it. Google had, I think, spent almost 10 years trying to get a new office in Sydney, and they kept giving environmental and behavioral data to the architects on these big terabyte hard drives. The architects would design a scheme, not look at the hard drives. Google would then fire them. That happened about 4 times, I think. And so there's no capacity to appreciate that data. So no one has the data literacy to understand what people are doing. And so through the kind of process of looking at the world, understanding it, and then thinking about what you should do about that, other design fields have bootstrapped themselves into positions where they're working really fast, they're working really effectively, they've got a really strong value proposition. And architecture really hasn't done that. And so what I think I'm getting at here is that you're all in this position now where you're starting this degree and you're going to be doing a bunch of courses that teach you about learning what people think, about learning how to interpret large amounts of data, about how to build systems that can measure the world. So you're going to do ubiquitous cities, and you're going to be learning how to use a microcontroller to change something, to turn lights on and off, to measure something in the world. You're going to do design computing next term, which is about interpreting large amounts of data. And all of these courses are going to set you up to be able to be a completely new type of designer in the built environment, or in any field if you want. And I think it's going to be a really interesting and exciting time. So that's probably enough for that. Does anyone have any questions? Tact. We finished it in 2019, I think. And then we published. The Merrickville Library toilets, I reckon, are some of the best toilets that you can get. They being the council, panicked a bit because at that point you weren't allowed to have all gender all gender toilets in a building, and so they made some male, some female. They'd cocked up the lighting a bit, but the biggest problem is that if you're going to go all gender, you have to put a sanitary bin in all of the toilets, which cost money, and they cheaped out. So if they hadn't, I think they would have been spot on, like pretty much as close to perfect as you can get. But the council lost their nerve at the last minute. Also, that was quite a long time after Merrickville Library was built. The best ones I've seen so far are at the Cradle Mountain Visitor Centre in Tasmania. They nailed it. Any other questions? Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question. It's a really great question. And there have been a few examples of where that's really backfired. So the Daily Mail in London put in under desk movement sensors. And so if you're like moving your leg, you're at your desk, and if there's no movement, you're not at your desk. And because they're journalists, their job involves quite a lot of not being at their desk. Like if you're at your desk, you're not chasing new stories, you're just writing things up. And there was no communication about this. They just said they just put them in, and then all the Daily Mail staff just walked out, like a massive walkout. And the big thing with all of this stuff is communicating what you're going to do with the data, what your ethical stance on what you're collecting is, that kind of thing. And we don't collect audio files, for instance. We only collect volume. We don't ever collect pictures. If we're going to do that image one we didn't store the pictures. We just counted the people in it and then threw the picture away. And we actually have a new technology that we're putting in at the moment that doesn't use pictures. It just uses radar right on the edge. It measures that stuff. And so one of the things that we're really keen on is like preserving the privacy of the people in the space. But it's always going to be a trade-off. So any amount of data that you collect is a harm to a person, right? But the harm often can be offset by a benefit that you provide to someone. And so whenever you're collecting data, you have to think like, is collecting this data a good thing or a bad thing on balance? And so until Trump was elected in 2016, people were just collecting all sorts of stuff. They were like, yeah, we'll just collect everything and then see what's useful. And a bunch of interesting stuff came out of that. And I'm sure you can read about in all kinds of big data books. But at the point when Trump was elected, everyone realized that they could be subpoenaed for that data. And nobody wanted to be the person who provided Trump with the list of all Muslims in the US or something like that, which would lead to like a massive amount of harm. And so people started thinking a lot more about kind of stale data on their system as a risk rather than a benefit. And so in terms of people's privacy and what people in offices feel about this stuff, it's really about communicating the benefits to people and also giving them an opportunity to opt out. So we had a system where we were trying to track people's position through space. And if you wanted to opt out, you could just open your sensor and pull the battery out. And that meant that you looked like you were being tracked. So you weren't an odd one out by not wearing the sensor, but you weren't actually providing any data. And so you could opt out in a kind of invisible way, or a visible way if you chose not to wear it. Does that make sense? It's a really, really difficult question. And we have to, like, my life is made significantly more difficult by having to go through a whole bunch of ethical discussions about whether we should or shouldn't be doing something. But I think ultimately, if we can make offices way, way better, then we should. The point of having this massive amount of resources allocated to this is that they do something valuable. And if they're just sitting there being useless, they're not really helping anyone. But the best way to reduce embodied energy or any energy in the building sector is to not build buildings. And so if we can make our buildings 10 or 15 times more efficient, then we should absolutely be chasing that rather than working out more efficient ways of building new buildings. Any other questions? Did that answer yours? Yeah. 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 It's tricky.